Section 18 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Theodosius the Great, Part 2. Theodosius is lauded as a Christian prince even more than Constantine, and as much as Alfred. He was what is called orthodox, and intensely so. He saw in Arianism a heresy fatal to the Church. "It is our pleasure," said he, "that all nations should steadfastly adhere to the religion which was taught by Saint Peter to the Romans, which is the sole deity of the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost, under an equal majesty; and we authorize the followers of this doctrine to assume the title of Catholic Christians." If Rome, under Damasus and the teachings of Jerome, was the seat of orthodoxy, Constantinople was the headquarters of Arianism. We, in our times, have no conception of the interest which all classes took in the metaphysics of theology. Said one of the writers of the day, "If you desire a man to change a piece of silver, he informs you wherein the Son differs from the Father. If you ask the price of a loaf, you are told in reply that the Son is inferior to the Father. If you inquire whether the bath is ready, the answer is that the Son was made out of nothing." The subtle questions pertaining to the Trinity were the theme of universal conversation, even amid the calamities of the times. Theodosius, as soon as he had finished his campaign against the Goths, summoned the Arian Archbishop of Constantinople, and demanded his subscription to the Nicene Creed or his resignation. It must be remembered that the Arians were in an overwhelming majority in the city, and occupied the principal churches. They complained of the injustice of removing their metropolitan, but the emperor was inflexible, and Gregory Nazianzen, the friend of Basil, was promoted to the vacant see, in the midst of popular grief and rage. 6 weeks afterwards Theodosius expelled from all the churches of his dominions, both of bishops and of presbyters, those who would not subscribe to the Nicene Creed. It was a great reformation, but effected without bloodshed. Moreover, in the year 381 he assembled a general council of 150 bishops at his capital to finish the work of the Council of Nicaea, and in which Arianism was condemned. In the space of 15 years 7 imperial edicts were fulminated against those who maintained that the Son was inferior to the Father. A fine equal to $2,000 was imposed on every person who should receive or promote an Arian ordination. The Arians were forbidden to assemble together in their churches, and by a sort of civil excommunication they were branded with infamy by the magistrates, and rendered incapable of civil offices of trust and emolument. Capital punishment even was inflicted on Manicheans. So it would appear that Theodosius inaugurated religious persecution for honest opinions, and his edicts were similar in spirit to those of Louis XIV. Against the Protestants, a great flaw in his character, but for which he is lauded by the Catholic historians. The eloquent Fléchier enlarges enthusiastically on the virtues of his private life, on his chastity, his temperance, his friendships, his magnanimity, as well as his zeal in extinguishing heresy. But for him Arianism might possibly have been the established religion of the empire, since not only the dialectical Greeks, but the sensuous Goths, inclined to that creed. Ulfilas, in his conversion of those barbarians, had made them the supporters of Arianism, not because they understood the subtle distinctions which theologians had made, but because it was the accepted and fashionable faith of Constantinople. Spain, however, through the commanding influence of Hosius, adhered to the doctrines of Athanasius, while the eloquence of the commanding intellects of the age was put forth in behalf of Trinitarianism. The great leader of Arianism had passed away when Augustine dictated to the Christian world from the little town of Hippo, and Jerome transplanted the monasticism of the East into the West. At Tours, Martin defended the same cause that Augustine had espoused in Africa; while at Milan, the court capital of the West, the venerable Ambrose confirmed Italy in the Latin creed. In Alexandria, the fierce Theophilus suppressed Arianism with the same weapons that he had used in extirpating the worship of Isis and Osiris. Chrysostom at Antioch was the equally strenuous advocate of the Athanasian Creed. We are struck with the appearance of these commanding intellects in the last days of the empire, not statesmen and generals, but ecclesiastics and churchmen, generally agreed in the interpretation of the faith as declared by Paul, and through whose counsels the emperor was unquestionably governed. In all matters of religion, Theodosius was simply the instrument of the great prelates of the age, the only great men that the age produced. After Theodosius had thus established the Nicene faith, so far as imperial authority, in conjunction with that of the great prelates, could do so, he closed the final contest with paganism itself. His laws against pagan sacrifices were severe. It was death to inspect the entrails of victims for sacrifice, and all other sacrifices, in the year 392, were made a capital offence. He even demolished the pagan temples, as the Scots destroyed the abbeys and convents which were the great monuments of mediaeval piety. The revenues of the temples were confiscated. Among the great works of ancient art which were destroyed, but might have been left or converted into Christian use, were the magnificent temple of Edessa and the Serapis of Alexandria, uniting the colossal grandeur of Egyptian with the graceful harmony of Grecian art. At Rome not only was the property of the temples confiscated, but also all privileges of the priesthood. The Vestal Virgins passed unhonored in the streets. Whoever permitted any pagan rite, even the hanging of a chaplet on a tree, forfeited his estate. The temples of Rome were not destroyed, as in Syria and Egypt, but as all their revenues were confiscated, public worship declined before the superior pomps of a sensuous and even idolatrous Christianity. The Theodosian Code, published by Theodosius the Younger, A.D. 438, while it incorporated Christian usages and laws in the legislation of the empire, did not, however, disturb the relation of master and slave; and when the empire fell, slavery still continued as it was in the times of Augustus and Diocletian. Nor did Christianity elevate imperial despotism into a wise and beneficent rule. It did not change perceptibly the habits of the aristocracy. The most vivid picture we have of the vices of the leading classes of Roman society are painted by a contemporaneous pagan historian, Ammianus Marcellinus; and many a Christian matron adorned herself with the false and colored hair, the ornaments, the rouge, and the silks of the pagan women in the time of Cleopatra. Never was luxury more enervating or magnificence more gorgeous, but without refinement, than in the generation that preceded the fall of Rome. And coexistent with the vices which prepared the way for the conquest of the barbarians was the wealth of the Christian clergy, who vied with the expiring paganism in the splendor of their churches, in the ornaments of their altars, and in the imposing ceremonial of their worship. The bishop became a great worldly potentate, and the strictest union was formed between the Church and State. The greatest beneficent change which the Church effected was in relation to divorce, the facility for which disgraced the old pagan civilization; but Christianity invested marriage with the utmost solemnity, so that it became a holy and indissoluble sacrament, to which the Catholic Church in the days of deepest degeneracy has ever clung, leaving to the Protestants the restoration of this old pagan custom of divorce, as well as the encouragement and laudation of a material civilization. The spirit of paganism never has been exorcised in any age of Christian progress and triumph, but has appeared from time to time in new forms. In the conquering Church of Constantine and Theodosius it adopted pagan emblems and gorgeous rites and ceremonies. In the Middle Ages it appeared in the dialectical contests of the Greek philosophers; in our times in the deification of the reason, in the apotheosis of art, in the inordinate value placed in the enjoyments of the body, and in the splendor of an outside life. Names are nothing. To day we are swinging to the Epicurean side of the Greeks and Romans as completely as they did in the age of Commodus and Aurelian. And none may dare to hurl their indignant protests without meeting a neglect and obloquy sometimes more hard to bear than the persecutions of Nero, of Trajan, of Leo X., of Louis XIV. If Theodosius were considered aside from his able administration of the empire and his patronage of the orthodox leaders of the Church, he would be subject to severe criticism. He was indolent, irascible, and severe. His name and memory are stained by a great crime, the slaughter of from 7,000 to 15,000 of the people of Thessalonica, one of the great crimes of history, but memorable for his repentance more than for his cruelty. Had Theodosius not submitted to excommunication and penance, and given every sign of grief and penitence for this terrible deed, he would have passed down in history as one of the cruelest of all the emperors, from Nero downwards; for nothing can excuse or even palliate so gigantic a crime, which shocked the whole civilized world, a crime more inexcusable than the slaughter of Saint Bartholomew or the massacre which followed the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Theodosius survived that massacre about 5 years, and died at Milan 395 at the age of 50, from a disease which was caused by the fatigues of war, which, with a constitution undermined by self indulgence, he was unable to bear. But whatever the cause of his death, it was universally lamented, not from love of him so much as from the sense of public dangers which he alone had the power to ward off. At his death his empire was divided between his two feeble sons, Honorius and Arcadius, and the general ruin which everybody began to fear soon took place. After Theodosius no great and warlike sovereign reigned over the crumbling and dismembered empire, and the ruin was as rapid as it was mournful. The Goths, released from the restraints and fears which Theodosius imposed, renewed their ravages, and the effeminate soldiers of the empire, who formerly had marched with a burden of 80 pounds, now threw away the heavy weapons of their ancestors, even their defensive armor, and of course made but feeble resistance. The barbarians advanced from conquering to conquer. Alaric, leader of the Goths, invaded Greece at the head of a numerous army. Degenerate soldiers guarded the pass where 300 Spartan heroes had once arrested the Persian hosts, and fled as Alaric approached. Even at Thermopylae no resistance was made. The country was laid waste with fire and sword. Athens purchased her preservation at an enormous ransom. Corinth, Argos, and Sparta yielded without a blow, but did not escape the doom of vanquished cities. Their palaces were burned, their families were enslaved, and their works of art were destroyed. Only one general remained to the desponding Arcadius, Stilicho, trained in the armies of Theodosius, who had virtually entrusted to him, although by birth a Vandal, the guardianship of his children. We see in these latter days of the empire that the best generals were of barbaric birth, an impressive commentary on the degeneracy of the legions. At the approach of Stilicho, Alaric retired at first, but collecting a force of 10,000 men, penetrated the Julian Alps, and advanced into Italy. The Emperor Honorius was obliged to summon to his rescue his dispirited legions from every quarter, even from the fortresses of the Rhine and the Caledonian Wall, with which Stilicho compelled Alaric to retire, but only on a subsidy of 2 tons of gold. The Roman people, supposing that they were delivered, returned to their circuses and gladiatorial shows. Yet Italy was only temporarily delivered, for Stilicho, the hero of Pollentia, with the collected forces of the whole Western Empire, might still have defied the armies of the Goths and staved off the ruin another generation, had not imperial jealousy and the voice of envy removed him from command. The supreme guardian of the Western Empire, in the greatest crisis of its history, himself removes the last hope of Rome. The frivolous Senate which Stilicho had saved, and the weak and timid emperor whom he guarded, were alike demented. Quos Deus vult perdere, prius dementant. In an evil hour the brave general was assassinated. The Gothic king, observing the revolutions at the palace, the elevation of incompetent generals, and the general security in which the people indulged, resolved to march to a renewed attack. Again he crossed the Alps with a still greater army, and invaded Italy, destroying everything in his path. Without obstruction he crossed the Apennines, ravaged the fertile plains of Umbria, and reached the city, which for 400 years had not been violated by the presence of a foreign enemy. The walls were then 25 miles in circuit, and contained so large a population that it affected indifference. Alaric made no attempt to take the city by storm, but quietly and patiently enclosed it with a cordon through which nothing could force its way, as the Prussians in our day invested Paris. The city, unprovided for a siege, soon felt all the evils of famine, to which pestilence was naturally added. In despair, the haughty citizens condescended to sue for a ransom. Alaric fixed the price of his retreat at the surrender of all the gold and silver, all the precious movables, and all the slaves of barbaric birth. He afterwards somewhat modified his demands, but marched away with more spoil than the Romans brought from Carthage and Antioch. Honorius entrenched himself at Ravenna, and refused to treat with the magnanimous Alaric. Again, consequently, he marched against the doomed capital, again invested it, again cut off supplies. In vain did the nobles organize a defence. There were no defenders. Slaves would not fight, and a degenerate rabble could not resist a warlike and superior race. Cowardice and treachery opened the gates. In the dead of night the Gothic trumpets rang unanswered in the streets. The old heroic virtues were gone. No resistance was made. Nobody fought from temples and palaces. The queen of the world, for 5 days and nights, was exposed to the lust and cupidity of despised barbarians. Yet a general slaughter was not made, and as much wealth as could be collected into the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul was spared. The superstitious barbarians in some degree respected churches. But the spoils of the city were immense and incalculable: gold, jewels, vestments, statues, vases, silver plate, precious furniture, spoils of Oriental cities, the collective treasures of the world, all were piled upon the Gothic wagons. The sons and daughters of patrician families became, in their turn, slaves to the barbarians. Fugitives thronged the shores of Syria and Egypt begging daily bread. The Roman world was filled with grief and consternation. Its proud capital was sacked, since no one would defend it. The empire fell, says Guizot, because no one belonged to it. The news of the capture made the tongue of old Saint Jerome to cling to the roof of his mouth in his cell at Bethlehem. "What is now to be seen," cried he, "but conflagration, slaughter, ruin, the universal shipwreck of society?" The same words of despair came from Saint Augustine and Hippo. Both had seen the city in the height of its material grandeur, and now it was laid low and desolate. The age of all things seemed to be at hand, and the only consolation of the great churchmen of the age was the belief in the second coming of our Lord. The sack of Rome by Alaric, A.D. 410, was followed in less than half a century by a second capture and a second spoliation at the hands of the Vandals, with Genseric at their head, a tribe of barbarians of kindred Germanic race, but fiercer instincts and more hideous peculiarities. This time the inhabitants of Rome, for Alaric had not destroyed it, only robbed it, put on no airs of indifference or defiance. They knew their weakness. They begged for mercy. The last hope of the city was her Christian bishop; and the great Leo, who was to Rome what Augustine had been to Carthage when that capital also fell into the hands of Vandals, hastened to the barbarian camps. The only concession he could get was that the lives of the people should be spared, a promise only partially kept. The second pillage lasted 14 days and nights. The Vandals transferred to their ships all that the Goths had left, even to the trophies of the churches and ancient temples, the statues which ornamented the capital, the holy vessels of the Jewish temple which Titus had brought from Jerusalem, imperial sideboards of massive silver, the jewels of senatorial families, with their wives and daughters, all were carried away to Carthage, the seat of the new empire of the Vandals, A.D. 455, then once more a flourishing city. The haughty capital met the fate which she had inflicted on her rival in the days of Cato the Censor, but fell still more ingloriously, and never would have recovered from this second fall had not her immortal bishop, rising with the greatness of the crisis, laid the foundation of a new power, that spiritual domination which controlled the Gothic nations for more than 1,000 years. With the fall of Rome, yet too great a city to be wholly despoiled or ruined, and which has remained even to this day the centre of what is most interesting in the world, I should close this lecture. But I must glance rapidly over the whole empire and show its condition when the imperial capital was spoiled, humiliated, and deserted. The Suevi, Alans, and Vandals invaded Spain, and erected their barbaric monarchies. The Goths were established in the south of Gaul, while the north was occupied by the Franks and Burgundians. England, abandoned by the Romans, was invaded by the Saxons, who formed permanent conquests. In Italy there were Goths and Heruli and Lombards. All these races were Germanic. They probably made serfs or slaves of the old population, or were incorporated with them. They became the new rulers of the devastated provinces, and all became, sooner or later, converts to a nominal Christianity, the supreme guardian of which was the Pope, whose authority they all recognized. The languages which sprang up in Europe were a blending of the Roman, Celtic, and Germanic. In Spain and Italy the Latin predominated, as the Saxon prevailed in England after the Norman conquest. Of all the new settlers in the Roman world, the Normans, who made no great incursions till the time of Charlemagne, were probably the strongest and most refined. But they all alike had the same national traits, substantially, and they entered upon the possessions of the Romans after various contests, more or less successful, for 250 years. The empire might have been invaded by these barbarians in the time of the Antonines, and perhaps earlier, but it would not have succumbed to them. The legions were then severely disciplined, the central power was established, and the seeds of ruin had not then brought forth their wretched fruits. But in the 5th century nothing could have saved the empire. Its decline had been rapid for 200 years, until at last it became as weak as the Oriental monarchies which Alexander subdued. It fell like a decayed and rotten tree. As a political state, all vitality had fled from it. The only remaining conservative forces came from Christianity, and Christianity was itself corrupted, and had become part of the institutions of the state. It is mournful to think that a brilliant external civilization was so feeble to arrest both decay and ruin. It is sad to think that neither art nor literature nor law had conservative strength, that the manners and habits of the people grew worse and worse, as is universally admitted, amid all the glories and triumphs and boastings of the proudest works of man. A world as fair and glorious as our own, says Sismondi, was permitted to perish. Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Athens, met the old fate of Babylon, of Tyre, of Carthage. Degeneracy was as marked and rapid in the former, notwithstanding all the civilizing influences of letters, jurisprudence, arts, and utilitarian science, as in the latter nations, a most significant and impressive commentary on the uniform destinies of nations, when those virtues on which the strength of man is based have passed away. An observer in the days of Theodosius would very likely have seen the churches of Rome as fully attended as are those in New York itself to day, and he would have seen a more magnificent city. And yet it fell. There is no cure for a corrupt and rotten civilization. As the farms of the old Puritans of Massachusetts and Connecticut are gradually but surely passing into the hands of the Irish, because the sons and grandsons of the old New England farmer prefer the uncertainties and excitements of a demoralized city life to laborious and honest work, so the possessions of the Romans passed into the hands of the German barbarians, who were strong and healthy and religious. They desolated, but they reconstructed. The punishment of the enervated and sensual Roman was by war. We in America do not fear this calamity, and have no present cause of fear, because we have not sunk to the weakness and wickedness of the Romans, and because we have no powerful external enemies. But if amid our magnificent triumphs of science and art we should accept the Epicureanism of the ancients and fall into their ways of life, then there would be the same decline which marked them, I mean in virtue and public morality, and there would be the same penalty, not perhaps destruction from external enemies, as in Persia, Syria, Greece, and Rome, but some grievous and unexpected series of catastrophes which would be as mournful, as humiliating, as ruinous, as were the incursions of the Germanic races. The operations of law, natural and moral, are uniform. No individual and no nation can escape its penalty. The world will not be destroyed, Christianity will not prove a failure, but new forces will arise over the old and prevail. Great changes will come. He whose right it is to rule will overturn and overturn; but creation shall succeed destruction, melodious birth songs will come from the fires of the burning phoenix, assuring us that the progress of the race is certain, even if nations are doomed to a decline and fall whenever conservative forces are not strong enough to resist the torrent of selfishness, vanity, and sin. Authorities. The original authorities are Ammianus Marcellinus, Zosimus, Sozomen, Socrates, Orations of Gregory Nazianzen, Theodoret, the Theodosian Code, Sulpicius Severus, Life of Martin of Tours, Life of Ambrose by Paulinus, Augustine's De Civitate Dei, Epistles of Ambrose, also those of Jerome, Claudian. The best modern authorities are Tillemont's History of the Emperors, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, Milmans's History of Christianity, Neander, Shepherd's Fall of Rome, and Flicier's Life of Theodosius. There are several popular lives of Theodosius in French, but very few in English. Section 18.